Day 73 of the U.S. war on Iran, a conflict expected to last weeks, has entered its third month, with global tensions rising fast. Just hours ago, Iran delivered its response to Washington's latest ceasefire proposal through Pakistani mediators in Islamabad, a response designed to show Tehran believes it controls the pace of this war. Iran is demanding a permanent end to hostilities, a full U.S. withdrawal from the region, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and compensation for damage caused by the U.S.-Israeli strikes. Tehran has postponed talks on its nuclear program and added a new condition: a ceasefire in Lebanon and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from border areas. Iran also says it will assume control of the undersea internet cables crossing the Strait of Hormuz, placing tolls and maintenance under Iranian authority. President Pezeshkian, meanwhile, declared, "We shall never bow before the enemy," while President Donald Trump insisted Iran had been defeated militarily but doesn't realize it yet. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to ensure commercial shipping. Oil prices are surging, fuel costs are rising, European industry is under pressure, and divisions are growing within NATO. Tonight, the key questions are no longer just military, but political and moral. Is this the beginning of a de-escalation or simply a pause before a wider conflict? All these questions and more are going to be put to my panel tonight on All 24 News Special. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to All 24 News Special with me, Karim Zachary. And before we bring in our guest, here is the latest in this report by our own Zahra Farjani, and then we come back to the discussion.
The Gulf region is witnessing another dangerous escalation, with growing fears that tensions around the Strait of Hormuz could spill into a wider confrontation. A US-flagged cargo ship caught fire Sunday after being struck by what British maritime authorities described as an unidentified projectile while sailing northeast of Doha. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Agency said investigations are underway, while ships operating in the area have been urged to remain on high alert. The incident comes as Western powers move to strengthen their military presence in the region. Britain announced the deployment of the destroyer HMS Dragon to the Middle East ahead of a possible mission to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. According to Bloomberg, the move is part of joint British and French preparations aimed at protecting maritime traffic through the strategic waterway. France is also stepping up its presence. The office of President Emmanuel Macron confirmed that the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle is heading towards the southern Red Sea as part of preparations for potential operation linked to securing the strait. On the Iranian side, the tone is becoming increasingly defiant. Iran's supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei called for additional support measures for the armed forces, urging them to confront what he described as enemies with firmness and strength. Iranian state media reported that senior commanders briefed the supreme leader on the military readiness, saying the country is prepared to respond quickly to any attack or what they called a strategic mistake. The Revolutionary Guard says its forces are now on maximum alert, warning that any attack on Iranian oil tankers or commercial vessels would trigger strikes on American bases and ships in the region. In a message posted on X, the commander of Iran's aerospace force claimed Iranian missiles and drones are already positioned and aimed at U.S. targets and naval vessels near the Strait of Hormuz awaiting orders. Iranian military officials also warned countries enforcing U.S. sanctions against Tehran that they could face difficulties crossing the strait, underscoring the growing risk of further escalation in one of the world's most sensitive maritime corridors.
And to help us dissect the geopolitical, economic, legal, and moral dimensions of this war, we're joined tonight by three distinguished voices. Dr. Yvonne Ridley, leader of the Scotland Workers' Party, a British author and Middle East commentator. Hello there, ma'am, and thank you for joining us from Glasgow.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening to you as well. And we're also honored to have Ms. Fatima Boulasrar, Senior Policy Analyst and Middle East expert, joining us from Washington, D.C. She's a sharp analyst of U.S. foreign policy, Gulf geopolitics, and the think tank industry complex, also the founder of Ideology Machine Projects. Hi, ma'am, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Thanks for having me, Kareem.
Thank you. And we're also honored to have Dr. Nail Quilliam, an associate fellow at the Chatham House, a Middle East and Gulf Affairs specialist, joining us from London. He brings an eye on the authority on the Gulf energy architecture, regional security, and diplomatic mediation. Hello, sir, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
Good evening. Very good to be with you tonight.
Thank you indeed. And now let's start the discussion with you, Ms. Fatima Boulasrar. Tehran took more than 48 hours actually to respond to Donald Trump's proposal, then delivered a sweeping 14-point counter-offer that includes demands Washington will find extremely difficult to accept. For example, full U.S. military withdrawal, compensation for the war damage, and a Lebanon ceasefire linked to the Israeli withdrawal. Trump is insisting Iran has been defeated militarily, but doesn't realize it. That's what he says. Analysts like John Mersheimer argue that the entity has no interest in any deal that accommodates Tehran's demands. So my question goes like this. Who is really dictating the terms here? And is the U.S. negotiating independently or constrained perhaps by an Israeli veto over any outcome that preserves Iran's regional influence? How do you see it?
It's a very complicated question. I think all sides are trying to project power at the moment and dominance and trying to say that they're victors of whatever outcome is going to happen. And the reality is Iran has been degraded. The IRGC doesn't have the same, perhaps, capacity that it had when it once started. But it doesn't want to admit this, and it still has enough capacity to cause some damage and disruption in the maritime sphere. So neither side is negotiating from a position of complete freedom, and that's an important thing to understand. So, and it's also very expected that Iran's response is continuously going to be maximalist. The purpose is not that Washington is going to accept every item in the deal or in the proposal, but the purpose is that it doesn't want to present itself as a defeated actor entering unconditional negotiations for just the sake of surrender. So it's trying to reestablish political leverage. That's very important for them, especially after military pressure has, kind of like widened the scope of the discussion and what has happened. And the IRGC has used Hormuz as leverage, and they want to definitely make sure that their proxies all over in Lebanon, especially in Lebanon, are not degraded. So they're tying in other factors, but it all affects the regional security architecture, and the U.S. presence sort of like has to be seen. For them, they want a complete withdrawal, because that would kind of like allow them the chance to breathe and regroup. But at the same time, as you mentioned, President Trump's rhetoric about Iran being completely defeated is not really realistic, because it's just a negotiation posture. So there's a bit of coercive logic in there, but the IRGC is sort of built to regenerate. They still have alliances and backing from other countries, from China, from Russia. Smuggling routes can help them rebuild, re-equip, especially at times of ceasefire. This is a regime that didn't necessarily care when Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who has been there for decades, died. It continued to stand, and it's built to withstand these shocks. It's a regime that have control for a very long time. So to simply say that, things have changed, they did not necessarily change for the Iranian people who have still to live under the IRGC. They're not changing in the Strait of Hormuz, where we're seeing, Iran impose some real costs on shipping lanes. And it's not altering, and it's not changing. The U.S. cannot claim total victory when it still has its bases and when the Gulf states remain vulnerable to IRGC attacks. So the negotiations are important. Ultimately, something is going to happen. A deal is going to happen, but the maximalist objectives and proposals that are being there, I think the entire point is to sort of like, I think from the rationale of the administration is going to attempt to continue applying military pressure until Iran says, or the IRGC says, that they're ready to make a deal, until both sides are satisfied with the deal.
More of a compromise, really.
Pretty much, and we can see something like this have happened. I mean, it's May 10th right now. May 6th last year was the anniversary date of the Trump administration and the Houthis coming into agreement on the Red Sea, and it happened sort of like quite quickly, quite abruptly. But if there's anything to be learned from that, is that it only happened when the Houthis realized that they withstood some pain, that they withstood some actual damage, and that allowed for the Houthis to capitulate and ultimately to come to this agreement. However, the narrative for the Houthis is that they saw themselves as a victor because they were able to withstand in front of a huge superpower like the United States. And I think what the IRGC is trying to do is to somehow, replicate that.
And find leverage. Perfect. Now, let me bring in Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Yvonne, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says international law is dead in practice due to Western double standards on Gaza, Ukraine, and also U.S.-Israel actions against Iran as well as Lebanon. So the U.S. has repeatedly vetoed UN resolutions on Israel, while now pushing for condemnation of Iran. Only 27% of Americans are supporting this war, and even European leaders have called aspects of it a violation of international law. So, is this the moment where Western credibility on international law finally collapses under its own contradictions? Or will past patterns, Iraq, Afghanistan, simply be repeated under a new narrative? How do you see it?
I think that the scales have fallen off the eyes of most of the people in the world today. And for the first time, possibly, we in the West are now seeing what the global South has been watching for all of these years, and that is double standards. The present debacle in the Strait of Hormuz, of course, there was never a problem in the Strait of Hormuz until Donald Trump began meddling with it. But looking for a single person who's in control, we may as well look into a crystal ball, because depending on who you ask, who is the architect of this chaos, the answer changes by the hour. President Trump thinks that he's in charge. At least that's what we read on Twitter, or his latest thing, which is called Truth Social. He's currently playing the role of the ultimate hard-to-please customer, rejecting peace proposals via social media, like a bad review, because Iran hasn't, what he says, paid a big enough price yet. And on the other side of the world, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is effectively the director of the It's Not Over Yet sequel, while the US and Pakistan are trying to pass notes in a classroom exam. And everyone has been reminded that unless Trump gets his hands on Iran's uranium stash, the story will continue. Meanwhile, Mojtaba Khomeini is technically in charge of Iran, though his main job right now seems to be sending unacceptable responses through Pakistani messengers, like a game of high stakes telephone. The Pakistan mediators are caught up in the middle. At first, they were, I think, quite happy to be seen as mediators. Now they are absolutely exhausted, trying to manage the chaos in the Middle East. They're essentially the delivery drivers trying to drop off a package while both the sender and the receiver are screaming at each other through the doorbell camera. In reality, control is currently a 4 or 5 way tug of war where the rope is on fire and everyone is claiming that they're winning. Should we look into the specific demands Iran just handed over to see what Trump found so unacceptable? You know, just a few minutes ago, he was tweeting saying totally unacceptable. But as usual, the president of the United States never goes into detail. And of course, that is where the devil is, in the detail.
Perfect. So if we come to talk about law, Dr. Yvonne Ridley, would you say that this is the moment where might actually has fully replaced law? And what does that mean, if it is the case, for the entire edifice of post-1945 international humanitarian concern or norms?
Well, of course, the law is in intensive care at the moment because as long as there are still places like Guantanamo open, which it is, a lot of people have forgotten about Guantanamo. People have forgotten about enhanced interrogation techniques, which was 3 words for torture. Deployed by the United States of America. Standards have fallen so low with regards to international law that there is no longer any respect for it. And much of this can go right back to 2003, when both Britain and America illegally invaded Iraq on the premise of weapons of mass destruction. And of course, that lie began to unravel within hours of the invasion when no weapons of mass destruction were found. But you can go right back to 1982, when a certain Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, was insisting that Iran was producing a nuclear weapon. And despite all its denials, Iran has never produced a nuclear weapon. And just last year, the country was bombed by the first salvo of the war between America and Iran. And Donald Trump told us then last year, it's all over. We've bombed them. We've destroyed them. They will never be able to come back, not for many years again. And this is our victory. And of course, a few months later, he's fighting them again, and Israel is singing the same song again, saying they've got nuclear weapons. And we're being told so many lies. And this is, again, lying in government has now become acceptable. It's incredible that we have reached the stage where the world is being treated like the playground of the schoolboy bully. And whoever has the might, as you said, has the right. And that is not justice in anyone's language.
Perfect, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Let me now bring Dr. Nail Quilliam. Dr. Nail, if we come to look at the people who are trapped in this war, comes the Gulf countries. So the U.S. Gulf security relationship has long been based on protection in exchange for energy stability and dollar recycling, facts which are known. But now the Gulf shipping lanes are threatened, ports are exposed, and oil markets are destabilized, while US producers are benefiting because they are actually close to the circle where the decision is being made. They know beforehand what Donald Trump is going to say, so whatever statements he make, it's going to affect the market. And of course, this is like a tight, narrow interest for these people. They are making profit out of it. But after this war, can the traditional Gulf US security architecture still survive, according to you? Or are we witnessing the slow breakdown of the post-1970s strategic pact?
Thank you for the question. I mean, we might be seeing the slow breakdown of that pact as you describe it, but it's going to happen at a snail's pace. I mean, realistically, the Gulf Arab states have no significant alternative. Of course, they are paying the cost directly at the moment from the US administration's policy and its actions and its war against Iran. And those Gulf states find themselves in a situation I'm sure they could never have imagined, although policy has been pointing in this way for some time. I think Gulf officials have made it very clear, and I think we have every reason to believe them, particularly Qatar, Saudi, and the UAE and Kuwait for sure, will remain very, very close to the US. What we do see, however, is Saudi Arabia looking to sort of diversify some of its security arrangements, its security partnerships. This is not something new. This does date back a good few years, because there has been concern, there has been a worry, specifically since the US began its pivot to Asia back in 2013, that the US is in some way withdrawing from the region. That's not what we see at the moment, of course, but we do see the Gulf states starting to look, Saudi Arabia in particular, I'm talking about here, looking for alternatives. Not alternatives, it can't swap out America. That is going to be a long-term security partner, but we do see it sort of exploring ways to work with Pakistan, with Turkey, with Egypt, looking for ways to diversify that. The UAE seems to be drawing closer to the US and certainly closer to Israel, and that looks to be one area that's going to strengthen over time. I think the Qataris have made it very clear that they have no alternative. I mean, they host Al Udeid. They are very, very close. So how I would characterize this, there may be a very slow unwinding of these positions, this security arrangement, but it's going to take a very long time. It's not something that we're going to see in the next few years.
But Dr. Nail, do you think this is actually a wise move from the Gulf countries if their security is actually compromised? And we see, for example, the attacks that they sustained at the level of the US military bases on the one hand, to a point that we saw the Gulf countries are the ones really protecting the USA, not the other way around.
Correct. I mean, that's a good question, but if they were to walk away from their security relationship with the US, they would be concerned that they would find themselves, in a troubled region, in a hostile region, and the threat from Iran, this is how they would perceive it, or the threat from Israel, in fact, would be even greater. One can argue, very clearly that the presence of a US military base on their soil, on their land, has made them a target for Iranian strikes. But I think the logic that the Gulf states would be looking through is, if we did not have US support now going forward, whatever arrangement plays out between the Iranians and the Americans, they would themselves be more exposed to an Iranian and Israeli threat. So for the time being, it makes sense for them to stay close to the US, but looking to diversify those security relationships. And as we know, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular are looking to develop some domestic military capability. It's going to take many, many decades before they can get anywhere serious or significant with that. But they are sort of walking down that path of looking for a new security paradigm. Mm-hmm. But they are just right at the beginning.
Yes, and Dr. Nail, again, Iran has announced plans to control all undersea internet cables passing through the Strait of Hormuz, a route carrying nearly global data or significant global data flows between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So this turns the Strait of Hormuz from an energy choke point into a dual energy and digital choke point. So how significant is this shift according to you? And does Iran now hold a form of strategic leverage, at least another one, that traditional, perhaps naval power cannot neutralize here?
I mean, it's not absolutely clear how Iran could, seize the cables. I think it's clear that they could most certainly damage the cables, and I suspect, that would be using their subsea submarines, and they certainly have that strength and that capability, and that's probably that origin around using dolphins, whatever that slightly odd story was about. Mm-hmm. But by alluding to a capability to damage, to disrupt, to seize those cables, it gives the Iranians another leverage, not just on the surface of the water, but certainly underneath. And you have three major cables running through Hormuz. The Asia-Africa-Europe cable, that connects Southeast Asia to Europe. It docks into Egypt, the UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. That's absolutely key. You have the Falcon network, which connects India, Sri Lanka, the Gulf, Sudan, and Egypt. And the important thing about these cables, they carry an estimated 30% of global internet traffic between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. But more importantly, they carry real-time settlement instructions for global currency markets. They transmit the order flows for commodity exchanges in London, Frankfurt, New York, and Singapore. If the Iranians have capability to disrupt that, that's going to hurt the rest of the world. So it's certainly another form of leverage that Iran could seek to exploit.
Perfect. Now let's move to Ms. Fatima Abul Asrar again. Fatima, a recent investigation identified major U.S. think tanks such as FDD, AEI, the Hudson Institute, WINAP, Heritage Foundation as really the key drivers of hardline U.S.-Iran policy, with strong, let's say, ideological alignment toward, Israeli strategic priorities and interests. So how does influence actually operate inside Washington's policy ecosystem there where you are observing? And to what extent is U.S.-Iran policy shaped by domestic debate versus perhaps external strategic priorities influencing it from the outside of the system? Fatima Abul Asrar, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry. I was on mute, sorry. So I think influence in Washington operates less like conspiracy and more of an ecosystem. And it's really important to understand this. What think tanks do effectively is they shape the intellectual environment, but they don't really dictate policy. So they can prepare the environment by which everything is debated. They produce, there's the language, there's the frameworks, there's the assessments, and and they alternate from one administration to the other. Certain other think tanks that you haven't mentioned, maybe the Carnegie, the CSI, Brookings, their policy might be weighted with, maybe a democratic establishment better. But the idea is that over time, these ideas that they shape are supposed to define what's considered to be credible and strategically acceptable in Washington. And I think one of the things that we have been observing recently is that power has become a little bit more centralized than we've seen before. So many institutions perhaps have limited influence than what is attributed to it at the moment. Even Congress itself is somehow limited in what it is trying to deliver right now because of the makeup of Congress and the maybe majority that's much more aligned with the Trump administration. So this makes the current political environment a bit more complicated. It's not as simple as Israel's influence is driving the policy, but much more of a complicated, really, set of understanding. And we understand also from the first Trump administration, there was a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, and it was rooted in the couple of issues. We had the ballistic missile capability and the proxy issue that was not really touched during former administrations. And we've seen also a political environment that has been vastly different from where it was before. So the world post October 2023 is different than the world before it, and all of that has maybe moved Washington to a bit more of a policy where it has started to consider the long-term impact of the Islamic regime on domestic politics, on international and regional stability, and so on and so forth. I would say maybe if the think tank policies and memos and debates were considered a little bit more carefully, there would have been much more of a pronounced strategic direction from this current administration, which we're not seeing at the moment. We're seeing a whole lot of improvisation. We're seeing the target and the rationale of going into Iran and starting this war change. We've seen, maximalist rhetoric from, we want to help, we want to have regime change, to we don't want to do anything like that, to we want to help liberate people of Iran, to we want to wipe out an entire civilization. And I think that inconsistency has reflected a very sort of centralized policy environment that not a lot of people in Washington, D.C. right now can actually decode successfully.
Mm-hmm. So would you agree with the fact that there is this perhaps rare consensus within the U.S. establishment that this is actually a war for the benefit of Tel Aviv, not Washington?
I wouldn't necessarily. I think there's certainly a growing debate in Washington about whether American and Israeli strategic interests are perfectly aligned in this escalation. We can see that, and it's become more visible than it has in the previous years. So there are voices within the U.S. establishment. I mean, we've seen the a resignation of a senior, intelligence officer over this issue. So the debate is certainly there, but there's also a concern that any kind of prolonged confrontation with Iran is going to risk drawing the United States into just an open-ended confrontation. Because this would reflect badly on the economy, on military, on the political costs, and may ultimately exceed any kind of benefit and strategic objective that would benefit Washington, D.C. itself. Arguably, there is a confluence of there's a convergence and interest between the United States and Israel, and the importance of having a strategic stability of Israel as well. But at what point would that bring diminishing costs to the United States? That becomes the question.
Perfect. Let's move now to Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Yvonne, if we come to look at reactions, we have, for example, the former Pentagon advisor and harsh critique of this war, Mr. Douglas MacGregor. He has said quite bluntly that the United States is fighting a war for Israel, paid for by American consumers and European industry. And speaking of industry, we see energy companies that are recording record profits as oil prices surge due to Hormuz disruptions, mainly benefiting American companies, perhaps close to the circle of Donald Trump, while humanitarian organizations report massive civilian suffering, infrastructure destruction, and blockade-related deprivation. How do you reconcile these record profits on one side with documented civilian suffering on the other, and of course Europe paying the cost, Africa paying the cost, the global South in general? And has war economy logic completely overridden humanitarian law?
There are a few people who are benefiting greatly from the antics of President Trump. And possibly he's doing very well and making quite a nice pile out of the misery and the chaos that has been caused to billions of other people who are really suffering. I mean, forget the front lines, the real victories are being won in air-conditioned boardrooms and luxury yachts. The big winners who are making a killing while everyone else is just dying are the oil barons. The Straits of Hormuz has become virtually a parking lot, and Saudi Aramco, BP, and Shell are performing the selfless service of charging us all triple for our fuel. Aramco's extra 5 billion profit is a touching tribute to their ability to find a detour while the world burns. And it turns out market volatility is just corporate speak for we're buying a second private island. The merchants of peace, those in the military industrial complex like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, are struggling under the heavy burden of record backlogs. And one of the biggest winners is Elbit Systems, the Israeli arms firm, which has seen its stock price soar by 45%. Proving that nothing says sound investment like a regional firestorm. And they aren't just restocking arsenals, they're restocking their executives' retirement funds. The Wall Street spectators are Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, who are checking in their first quarter profits, a cool $48 billion. And let's not forget the visionaries at Polymarket, who have turned a war into a casino, raking in $1 million a day from people betting on how many days the tragedy will last. It's like the Super Bowl, but with more missiles and better margins. Benjamin Netanyahu has also pulled off the ultimate Houdini trick, using a war to make 62% approval rating and a disappearing act for his corruption charges, which takes us back to international law and justice. Elsewhere, Russia and China are sitting back with the popcorn, enjoying a distracted US and a massive surge in fuel revenue. It's amazing how much you can get done when your biggest rival is busy shouting at a telephone in Washington. Essentially, the war is a rip-roaring success for everyone except ordinary people like van drivers, lorry drivers, train drivers, and even airlines, anybody who needs fuel to get around day by day. And the biggest fear in all of this now is the so-called scissor operation, where Iran may just take a scissor to the cables that the previous panelist was talking about, these invisible glass highways that transfer around $10 trillion in daily transactions. So while trades in London, New York, Singapore might feel virtual, they rely on these physical strands of glass, no thicker than a garden hose, sitting on the seafloor of the Straits of Hormuz. Should Iran go for the scissor option, then we will see the chaos absolutely spread. And this is all down to one Donald Trump.
And since you mentioned earlier international law, Dr. Yvonne, if we look, for example, the U.S. Naval blockade of Iran has actually restricted not only oil exports, but also food and medicine flows. And speaking of international law, we can speak about Article 33 of the Geneva Convention that prohibits collective punishment. So, if starvation and deprivation are considered war crimes in other contexts, can similar actions ever be justified under maximum pressure policies, or is international humanitarian law again applied selectively?
Well, it depends where you believe the civilized world is. It's certainly not in America. The blockade of Cuba is brutal and inhumane. And they're now doing the same with the Iranians. And of course, this has been happening day in, day out for the last 2.5 years in Gaza, which is still in the grip of a war. There isn't a ceasefire going on there. And it's really the rules of the game have just gone. President Trump has broken all the rules, and yet he will be the first to squeal as soon as anybody gives America a simple taste of what they have made the rest of us endure since he became president.
Perfect, Dr. Yvonne. Let me bring back Dr. Nail Quilliam. Dr. Nail, again, my question about the Gulf countries and the Gulf states who are really accelerating alternative export routes through Oman, the Red Sea, and LNG infrastructure to reduce dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. So, are these temporary contingency plans are something that are going to be the beginning of a permanent reconstructing of global energy geography away from the Gulf choke point? or it's still going to be temporary just for the moment?
It's a great question. And I think that countries like Saudi Arabia in particular, where we see them, I mean, we've already had reference to that, managing to, transport their oil from east to west and out of Yanbu, they can effectively export 4 to 5 million barrels a day. So they're down from their regular 7 million barrels a day. We do see a shift towards the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia, and that's likely to be a long-term decision, but that will really take a long time if they put in sufficient infrastructure to lessen or lower their dependency on Hormuz. UAE does not have that luxury, of course. I mean, it can export through Fujairah and is exporting 1.4, 1.5 million barrels a day. But Kuwait and Qatar, I mean, they're stuck. They have no real alternative. It's not as though they can build large pipelines to convey their LNG. So we will see some Gulf states, I think, preparing long-term plans to lower that vulnerability, because now that the strait has been closed, it can be closed again, no matter what deal is arrived at between the US and Iran. So Saudi Arabia will do its utmost. Oman, of course, sort of is sat in a different position there. It's in a more comfortable position, but no, I mean, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain too are very much kind of locked into that. So that's going to remain a key vulnerability for some time. I mean, there's a lot of talk, and there has been for some time, about pipelines. I mean, literal and virtual pipelines for IMEC, passing up through Saudi, through the Emirates, up through Jordan. Syria now is a relatively stable country in the region, wants to make itself a key connector. But if any of these projects were to materialize, they would take at least a good decade or 15 years to really come into fruition. So basically, for the time being, there is no true replacement for Hormuz, and there wouldn't be for a long time.
And if there was any alternative, because a lot of analysts said that there could be alternatives, but the alternatives are rather costly, how would you see this affecting, for example, European independence in terms of energy?
So the Europeans will, I mean, they have to respond at the moment, but they will push harder on net zero. I mean, for the time being, in the short to medium term, energy security is very much sort of back what it has been since 2022, and there has been a shift back towards hydrocarbons. But ultimately, there's going to be a push on clean fuels. There's going to be a harder push on renewables, wanting to lower and lessen dependence on hydrocarbons. I mean, that's going to be the strategic direction in which they're going to go. They're going to head towards. But what we're going to see, I mean, we don't know how this situation is going to play out. But I would imagine it's going to play out before those long-term options are really put into place for the Gulf states to export, their gas and their oil and all the derivatives that come from that. So in sort of that's going to take quite a long time to happen. So in the interim, we're going to see continued high oil prices, high gas prices, and even if there were a resolution tomorrow, number one, it's going to take at least a good 6 to 9 months, if not longer, until those countries are producing again and can export to the same levels they were doing before. That's going to be absolutely critical. So we're going to be living with these high prices for quite some time. And in fact, Dr. Yvonne was sort of referring to the volatility and what we're seeing at the moment, a lot of that is sentiment that the shortages, the oil and gas shortages, are going to start to hit us soon. They haven't hit us fully yet. And when they do, that's going to bring a really high cost to all the developing nations and to all the consuming nations.
Thank you, Dr. Nail. Now, let me get back to Ms. Fatima Abu Asrar. Fatima, despite the rising opposition in Congress and the low public support, no formal war authorization vote has taken place. Why has Congress effectively stepped aside from its constitutional role in authorizing war? And is this a future failure of institutions in the United States after this incident, or perhaps of political independence within Washington?
That's a very good question. I think what we have been seeing in recent years, through the past decade, I think the balance of power in the United States has been gradually shifting toward the executive branch. And, particularly in conflicts around the world and in the Middle East, where it's framed around either, maritime security or around deterrence or counterterrorism. So that kind of has allowed certain powers in the executive to immediately react to threats that they think they can contain them. And we've seen President Trump, he was extremely transparent in the way that he said, we're not going to call it a war, we're going to call it a conflict. And then he calls it a war again. He's been, using these terms, including even declaring victory, in order to be able to continue exercising his executive powers. How Congress reacts to this, I think, maybe in the current administration and in the current situation where there is a Republican majority, you can maybe expect less of an outcome that wouldn't be aligned with President Trump at the moment, although there has been some critics from within the movement. But I think just kind of the nature of the conflict somehow is making it much easier to bypass Congress. So, and also I think it's also very important to understand that the threat as well that others, that, for example, the IRGC is using through drones and proxies, cyber operations, interruption of shipping. The administration often argues that it needs much more flexibility in responding to these in real time.
Thank you so much, Fatima Abu Asrar. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. And Dr. Yvonne Ridley, very briefly, what is the endgame scenario according to you? After especially seeing Iran's ceasefire proposal links Hormuz stability to a ceasefire, for example, in Lebanon, and the complete occupation withdrawal from border areas in Lebanon. According to you, is this linkage a diplomatic strategy reflecting regional interconnectedness, perhaps, or a condition that makes de-escalation structurally impossible if unresolved?
Well, the end game, I mean, my money is still on Iran. It has its hands on the asymmetric lever. Iran is effectively controlling a digital hostage situation. Pay the tolls and follow our laws, or risk the global financial architecture going dark and the consequences of that. With the waterway already mined and closed to most shipping, repairing any accidental cuts will be virtually impossible because repair ships won't be able to safely enter the zone. So we should perhaps be looking at the emergency backup routes that are being proposed, like the digital land bridge Nail alluded to through Saudi Arabia, to see if they can actually handle the traffic if Hormuz goes dark. The solution or outcome may be an agree to disagree settlement, a memorandum of understanding, but this will only be after global gas prices have been driven up to $10 a gallon. It's all I can see ahead is chaos, absolute chaos, and a rise in oil prices, and the billionaire oil barons getting richer.
Thank you, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Dr. Nail Quilliam, very briefly, how do you see the end game scenario?
I think the sides are so far apart. I think it's very difficult to see any end game scenario. This discussion has moved away really from almost from the nuclear negotiations. I mean, they're still key, and part of this talk of a ballistic missiles program is now out. I think discussions around the use of Iran's proxies are out, and we have sort of two key issues here. One is Hormuz, and that's on the surface, and as we've just heard, that's at the subsea level. That's clear. That's becoming a major issue that has to be negotiated around. But the Iranians are not just going to simply give that up. They're going to want something very serious in return for that. And I see them just holding on to Hormuz for a very long time, and basically sort of trying to wait this out, play this out until Donald Trump is willing to make some concessions. But the two parties are so far apart, and the issue really is that the US does not have a substantive negotiating team that can go in and get back to serious negotiations and look at the fine detail. I think one of our colleagues talked about the devil is in the detail, and certainly the people that are leading from the White House on these issues have no idea about the detail.
Thank you, Dr. Nail Quilliam. We have to leave it there. My thanks to all our distinguished guests, Dr. Yvonne Ridley in Glasgow, Ms. Fatima Abu Al-Asrar in Washington, and Dr. Nail Quilliam in London. Thank you all indeed for all the sharp and honest analysis. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. At the beginning of day 73, a sobering picture is emerging, not just of a war, but of an entire global order under strain. A conflict sold as deterrence has instead exposed deep contradictions in international law, global energy dependence, and the balance of power. We've seen markets destabilized, alliances strained, and diplomatic assumptions rewritten in real time. Iran's counterproposal has not only shifted negotiations, it has reframed the conflict itself from a question of military superiority to a question of political endurance, legitimacy, and global credibility. The question now is no longer just how this war ends, but what kind of international system emerges from it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to our channel, and until next time, have a good one.